Traditions and Encounters: A Brief Global History by Jerry H. Bentley. Chapter 1, Part 1. The Early Complex Societies, 3,500 to 500 BC. About 12,000 years ago, humans crossed an important threshold when they began to experiment with agriculture. It quickly became clear that cultivation of crops provided a larger, more reliable food supply than foraging. Groups that turned to agriculture experienced rapid population growth, and they settled into permanent communities. Some of these developed into cities and became the world's first complex societies. The development of complex societies. The term complex society refers to a form of a large-scale social organization in which productive cultural economies produce surplus food. That surplus allowed some people to devote their time to specialized tasks other than food production and to congregate in urban settlements. During the centuries from 3,500 BC to 500 BCE, complex societies arose independently in several regions of the world, including Mesopotamia, Egypt, northern India, China, Mesoamerica, and the central Andean region of South America. Each established political authorities, built states with formal governmental institutions, collected surplus agricultural production in the form of taxes or tribute, and redistributed wealth. Complex societies also traded with other peoples, and they often sought to extend their authority to surround territories. Increased social distinctions. Complex societies were able to generate and preserve much more wealth than smaller societies. When bequeathed to heirs and held within particular families, the accumulated wealth became the foundation for social distinctions. These societies developed different kinds of social distinctions, but all recognized several classes of people, including ruling elites, common people, and slaves. The growth of sophisticated cultural traditions. All early complex societies also created sophisticated cultural traditions. Most of them either invented or borrowed a system of writing, which quickly came to be used to construct traditions of literature, learning, and reflection. All of the complex societies organized a formal education that introduced intellectual elites to skills such as writing and astronomical observation deemed necessary for their society's survival. In addition, all of these societies explored the nature of humanity, the world, and the gods. The differences between complex societies. Although all early complex societies shared some common features, each nevertheless developed distinct cultural, political, social, and economic traditions of its own. These distinctions were based, at least initially, on geographical differences. The differing availability of resources, for instance, the absence or presence of large supplies of fresh water, of river or ocean transport, of mountains or desert, or of large draft animals or domesticable plants helped structure the shape of early economic activities, cultural beliefs, and state structures. As a result, early complex societies in different parts of the New World grew into a variety of rich and unique cultures. Connections between complex societies. At the same time, none of the early complex societies developed their distinct cultures in complete isolation. Indeed, each interacted with neighboring peoples with whom they traded valuable items, fought, married, and borrowed ideas about government, philosophy, or religion. In many ways, these encounters were crucial to the development of early complex societies. Because of this, it seems clear that even in the earliest complex societies, connections between people were an important part of the human story. What factors provided the catalyst for the development of the first complex societies? Number two, what needs prompted people in most complex societies to interact with neighboring societies, and what might have been result of these interactions? Chapter 1, the foundations of complex societies. Eyewitness, Gilgamesh, man, and the myth. By far most familiar individuals of ancient Mesopotamia society was a man named Gilgamesh. According to historical sources, Gilgamesh was the fifth king of the city of Uruk. He ruled about 2750 BCE, and he led his community in its conflict with the Kish, a nearby city that was the principal rival of Uruk. Gilgamesh was a figure of Mesopotamian mythology and folklore, as well as history. He was the subject of numerous poems and legends, and Mesopotamian bards made him the central figure in a cycle of stories known as collectively as the Epic of Gilgamesh. As a figure of legend, Gilgamesh became the greatest hero figure of ancient Mesopotamia. According to the stories, the gods granted Gilgamesh a perfect body and endowed him with superhuman strength and courage. The legends declared that he constructed the massive city walls of Uruk, as well as several of the city's magnificent temples to Mesopotamian deities. The stories that make up the Epic of Gilgamesh recount the adventures of his hero and his cherished friend Enkidu as they sought fame. They killed an evil monster, rescued Uruk from a ravaging bull, and matched wits with the gods. In spite of their heroic deeds, Enkidu offended the gods and fell under a sentence of death. His loss profoundly affected Gilgamesh, who sought for some means to cheat death and gain eternal life. He eventually found a magical plant that had the power to confer immortality, but a serpent stole the plant and carried it away. Forcing Gilgamesh to recognize that death is the ultimate fate of all human beings. Thus, while focusing on the activities of Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the stories explored themes of friendship, loyalty, ambition, fear of death, and longing for immortality. In doing so, they reflected the interests and concerns of complex, urban-based society that had recently emerged in Mesopotamia. Yet such interests and concerns had their foundation deep in the human past. By the time Mesopotamian society emerged, their own species of human, Homo sapiens, had existed for about 2,000 years. These humans, who themselves descended from earlier hominins, were already accomplished problem solvers and thinkers, long before urban societies developed. In fact, early human communities were responsible for laying the social, economic, and cultural foundations on which their descendants built increasingly complex societies, especially through the domestication of plants and animals and by establishing agricultural economies. Indeed, productive agricultural economies supported the development of the first known complex societies during the 4th millennium BCE. Such societies, in which sizable numbers of people lived in cities and extended their political, social, economic, and cultural influence over large regions, emerged first in Southwest Asia, particularly in Mesopotamia. As these complex societies developed and grew, people found that they needed to resolve dispute that inevitably arose as individual and group interests conflicted. In Mesopotamia, settled agricultural peoples in search of order recognized political authorities and built states. The establishment of states in turn encouraged the creation of empires as to some states sought to extend their power by imposing their rule on neighboring lands. The transition out to agricultural. Between 12 and 6,000 years ago, humans crossed a critical threshold of immense significance for the species and the earth more generally when they began to domesticate plants and animals. That transition led to agriculture, led to a population explosion which enabled human communities to establish themselves in far greater numbers around the world than ever before. Agriculture also led to new forms of social organization, which ultimately resulted in the birth of the world's first urban centers. Apart from stimulating the establishment of states, urban society in Mesopotamia also promoted the emergence of social classes, thus giving rise to increasingly complex social and economic structures. Cities fostered specialized labor and the efficient production of high quality goods, in turn stimulated trade. Furthermore, early Mesopotamia developed distinctive cultural traditions as Mesopotamians invented a system of writing and supported organized religions. Mesopotamian and other peoples regularly interacted with one another, which helped further the geographic reach of the Mesopotamian society. Some Indo-European peoples also had direct dealings with their Mesopotamian contemporaries, with effects crucial for both Indo-European and Mesopotamian societies. Other Indo-European peoples probably never heard of Mesopotamia, but they employed Mesopotamian inventions such as wheels and metallurgy when undertaking extensive migrations that profoundly influenced historical development throughout much of Eurasia, from Western Europe to India and beyond. Even in the earliest days of the city life, the world was the site of frequent and intense interaction between peoples of different societies. The Paleolithic era. Homo sapiens, consciously thinking human, the direct ancestor of our own subspecies, Homo sapiens evolved about 200,000 years ago from a hominid ancestry that originated in East Africa about 4 to 5 million years ago. Homo sapiens possessed larger brains and greater intelligence than earlier hominins, a feature that enabled them to adapt to widely varying environmental conditions and to displace earlier hominin species. More than 100,000 years ago, communities of Homo sapiens began to spread throughout the temperate lands of the Eastern Hemisphere, using their intelligence to make warm clothes and shelters. Homo sapiens soon established communities in progressively colder regions. Then, between 60 and 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens took advantage of land bridges exposed by lower sea levels and spread to Indonesia, New Guinea, Australia, and finally the Americas. Thus, by about 15,000 years ago, communities of Homo sapiens had appeared in almost every habitable region of the world. For most of the human existence, indeed, from the evolution of the first hominids up until about 12,000 years ago, our ancestors foraged their food. In other words, they hunted wild animals or gathered edible products of naturally growing plants. That reliance on foraging characterized what historians and archaeologists call the Paleolithic era, or the Old Stone Age. The conditions of foraging economies decisively influenced all dimensions of the human experience during the Paleolithic era. For instance, because of the constant mobility in the search for food. A foraging economy virtually prohibits individuals from accumulating private property and basing social distinctions on wealth. In the absence of accumulated wealth, hunters and gatherers of Paleolithic times probably lived a relatively egalitarian existence. Some scholars believe that this relative social equality also extended to relations between the sexes because all members of the Paleolithic group made important contributions to the survival of the community. Although meat from the hunt, provided by men, was the most highly prized item in the Paleolithic diet, plant foods provided by women were essential to survival and sustained communities when the hunt did not succeed. Because of the thorough interdependence of the sexes from the viewpoint of food production, Paleolithic society probably did not encourage the domination of one sex by the other. The Neolithic era. Between 12 and 6,000 years ago, human communities in a variety of locations underwent profound economic, social, and political changes. When they began to experiment with the domestication of plants and animals, scientists refer to this period as the Neolithic era, or New Stone Age. Because of the polished stone tools associated with peoples who relied on cultivation for subsistence, Neolithic peoples sought to ensure themselves more regular food supplies by encouraging the growth of edible crops and bringing wild animals into dependence of human keepers. Many scholars believe that women most likely began a systematic care of plants. As the principal gatherers in foraging communities, women in Neolithic societies probably began to nurture plants instead of simply collecting available foods in the wild. Meanwhile, instead of just stalking game with the intention of killing it for meat, Neolithic men began to capture animals and domesticate them by providing for their needs and supervising their breeding over a period of decades and centuries. These practices gradually led to the formation of agricultural economies. The early spread of agriculture. The transition to agriculture, including both the cultivation of crops and the domestication of animals, emerged independently in several parts of the world. The earliest evidence of agricultural activity discovered so far by dates to the era after 9000 BCE in Southwest Asia, modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. Between 9000 and 7000 BCE, agriculture also emerged among African peoples inhabiting the southeastern margin of the Sahara Desert, modern-day Sudan, and then among the peoples of sub-Saharan West Africa in the vicinity of the modern Nigeria between 8000 and 6000 BCE. In East Asia, residents of the Yangtze River Valley began to cultivate crops as early as 6500 BCE, and their neighbors to the north in the Yellow River Valley did the same after 5500 BCE. In Southeast Asia, the cultivation of crops dates from the interdependent but very early time, probably 3000 BCE or earlier in the Western Hemisphere. Inhabitants of Mesoamerica, Central Mexico, cultivated plants as early as 4000 BCE, and residents of the Central Andean region of South America, Mana, Peru, followed suit after 3000 BCE. It is possible that the Amazon River Valley was yet another site of independently invented agriculture. Once established, agriculture spread rapidly as a result. Foods originally cultivated in only one region also spread widely as merchants, migrants, or other travelers carried knowledge of these foods to agricultural lands that previously had relied on different crops. However, agriculture did not spread rapidly because it was easier than foraging. On the contrary, agriculture involved long hours of hard physical labor, clearing land, preparing fields, planting seeds, pulling weeds, and harvesting crops, and thus probably required more work than the Paleolithic foraging. Yet over time, agriculture made possible the production of abundant food supplies, which in turn allowed human populations to grow to unprecedented levels. For example, historians estimate that before agriculture, before 10,000 BCE, the Earth's human population was about 4 million. By 500 BCE, after agriculture had spread to most world regions, the human population had risen to about 100 million. The development of social distinctions. Such rapidly increasing populations encouraged Neolithic peoples to adopt new forms of social organization. Because they devoted their time to cultivation rather than to foraging, Neolithic peoples did not continue to migratory life of their Paleolithic predecessors, but rather settled near their fields in permanent villages. Most people in Neolithic villages cultivated crops or kept animals, and many even continued to hunt and forage for wild plants. But a surplus of food enabled some individuals to concentrate their time and talents on prizes that had nothing to do with the production of food, especially pottery making, metallurgy, and textile production. Moreover, the concentration of people into permanent settlements and the increasing specialization of labor provided the first opportunity for individuals to accumulate considerable wealth. The institutionalized a private-owned landed property, which occurred at an uncertain date after the introduction of agriculture, enhanced the significance of accumulated wealth because the land was and remains the ultimate source of wealth in any agricultural society. Ownership of land carried enormous economic power. When especially successful individuals managed to consolidate wealth in their families' hands and kept it for several generations, clearly defined social classes emerged. Catalhayak. Within 4,000 years of its introduction, agriculture had dramatically transformed the face of the earth. Human beings multiplied prodigiously, congregated in densely populated quarters, placed the surrounding lands under cultivation, and domesticated several species of animals. Besides altering the physical appearance of the earth, agriculture transformed the lives of human beings. Even a modest Neolithic village dwarfed a Paleolithic band of a few dozen hunters and gatherers. In larger villages and towns with their populations of several thousand people, their specialized labor and their craft industries, social relationships became more complex than would have been conceivable during Paleolithic times. Excavations carried out by Catalhayak, one of the best known Neolithic settlements, have helped confirm that view. Located in south-central Anatolia, modern Turkey, Çatalhöyük grew from a small village to a bustling town of 5,000 inhabitants between its settlements in 7250 BCE and its abandonment in 5400 BCE. Archaeological evidence indicates that because the site was so close to a large obsidian deposits, Çatalhöyük became a center for production and trade of obsidian tools. The wealth generated from such trade in turn allowed increasing specialization of labor so that residents could eventually manufactured and traded pots, textiles, leather, beads, and jewelry at the site. Gradually, dense populations, specialized labor in complex social relations, such as those that developed the Çatalhöyük, gave rise to an altogether new form of social organization, the city. The quest for order. The earliest known cities grew out of agricultural villages and towns of the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, during the 4th millennium BCE. Human population increased rapidly in the area, which in turn presented inhabitants with the challenge of keeping order in a large-scale society. Over time, by experimentation and adaptation, they created states and governmental machinery that brought political and social order to their territories. Moreover, effective political and military organizations enabled them to build regional empires and extend their authority to neighboring peoples. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The place name Mesopotamia comes from two Greek words meaning the land between the rivers. This was one of 4 river valley regions in which ancient civilizations were established. Each shared important geographical features, including dry soils and environment that was slowly drying and warming following the end of the last ice age, and seasonally flooding rivers that made irrigation agriculture possible. So, although Mesopotamia received little rainfall, the Tigris and Euphrates brought large volumes of fresh water to the region. Early cultivators realized that by tapping these rivers, building reservoirs, or digging canals, they could irrigate fields of barley, wheat, and peas. Small-scale irrigation began in Mesopotamia soon after the 6000 BCE. Sumer. After artificial irrigation led to increased food supplies, which in turn supported rapidly increasing human populations and attracted migrants from other regions. Human numbers grew especially fast in the land of Sumer. In the southern half of Mesopotamia, by about 5000 BCE, the Sumerians were constructing elaborate irrigation networks that helped them realize abundant agriculture harvest. By 3000 BCE, the population of Sumer approached 100,000, an unprecedented concentration of people in ancient times. And the Sumerians were the dominant people of Mesopotamia. Semitic migrants. While supporting a growing population, the wealth of Sumer also attracted migrants from other regions. Most of the new arrivals were Semitic peoples who called them because they spoke tongues in the Semitic family of languages, including Hebrew, including Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, and Phoenician. Semitic peoples were nomadic herders who went to Mesopotamia from the Arabian and Syrian desert to the south and west. They often intermarried with the Sumerians, and they largely adapted to the Sumerian ways. This is the end of part 1.